Hi everyone, Dan Gunner from Insane Forensics. Welcome back to Tech Talk Tuesday, where every week we try to give something to help your threat hunting and security program. And today what we're going to do is we're going to continue our series on writing incident response plans, policies, and procedures. This week we're in part 3, which is writing procedures. When we get into it, a lot of people think when you say write an incident response plan, if they're technical, a lot of times they start with procedures. And while this is one approach, the problem is if you start with procedures, sometimes you miss out on the important policy or plan elements that your organization expects you to go in there. So I definitely recommend, if you're starting here, definitely make sure to check out the policy and plan videos that we made, because today we're at the bottom of really this series, to where what we're talking about today won't make sense unless you're actually also considering the incident response policy and plan. So let's hop right in. So kind of the backing of this entire series has been NIST 800-61. This is a publication put out by the government that kind of provides best practices on how to do incident response. Things like, how do you organize your incident response capability? How do you handle incidents? How do you do things like coordination and info sharing, right? This is a great document for building a plan if you need to, or updating your plan. And the advantage here is that you have something, instead of starting from scratch, you have some best practices to go with. Today, as we walk through it, right? Again, we talked about the difference between policy, plan, and procedures. Quick thing, policy at the overarching enterprise level, what your policy does is it defines kind of the overall scope and expectations management has. The IR plan then kind of gets into how you're going to organize that, how you're going to take the authority that the IR policy defines. And what we'll talk about today, the IR procedures, are how you actually do it when you're called up. So today, it's very much going to be about how you tailor that incident response policy and plan actually down into action that fits your environment. So if you're curious, the difference between policy, plan, and procedures, that's kind of a very quick overview of what it is. So when you hop into building incident response procedures, you have to start with that policy and plan, right? Because eventually, the big question here is, what are those procedures actually responsible for, right? What geography, what locations are you responsible for? What business units? Are there parts of the organization that are off the table? Are there parts of the organization that are more important when it comes to incident response? As you're writing your IR procedures, if you're having to prioritize where you're going to respond, understanding where you should respond first, where you can say, hey, we're going to wait on this site till later. Revenue lines, we talked about this a bit in the past videos too, right? But what revenue lines is your incident response plan responsible for protecting, right? Is there a certain product or service that your business provides that the incident response plan needs to be tailored to? Then what you can get from there that's defined out of the policy and plans is, what metrics do you need to consider as you're going out there, right? What are the response times? What are the reporting times? What do I need to make sure that I do as I'm writing procedures to make sure the procedures are complete, but that I'm also meeting all the expectations that are being passed down? Knowing what you are and aren't responsible is critical, because otherwise you're going to end up writing a lot of incident response procedures for areas that you'll actually never use. So you're just kind of wasting your own time at that point. Second, what you need to do is identify the environments and the severity to drive the plan. What environments are you responding in? How are those environments different, right? Is the tooling actually going to be different between those environments, right? Are there different elements of that plan and policy? Are there different legal requirements? Are there different considerations in the environment? When you get into procedures, all of those things matter, because you might be able to write one set of incident response procedures for your entire organization. Or what you might find is you might say, hey, between these two different types of environments, I have very different approaches I have to take for legal, for tool reasons, for access, for, just the considerations of what's there. So it's very important as you get into procedure writing that you understand, the environment you're ultimately going into. What is the terrain, right? Severity. We talked a lot about severity in the incident response policy video. So if you need a deeper dive on severity, go check that out. But, severity is going to drive your actions too, right? Severity also gives you a starting point to say, okay, if I'm using the Department of Defense or DHS's severity ratings from 10 years ago at the time of the making of this video, how you respond to a root level compromise versus how you respond to reconnaissance is going to be different. Those procedures on who you wake up at 2 in the morning, on who, when you pull the trigger to bring in an expensive IR retainer, all of those things are going to drive different actions. And your IR procedure should kind of provide that base playbook to say, this is what we think we're going to do when we have a root level compromise. This is what we think we're going to do, when we have unsuccessful activity attempt, right? And you can kind of build that choose your own adventure book, kind of those diagrams of where you're going to go based on understanding both the environments and severity. So third, this is where you get into kind of the nitty-gritty technical part, right? So you know the environment, you know your severity, you know what you're responsible for, you understand your plans and policies. Now, this is where you're actually going to do the fun technical work, and you're going to say, okay, what are the incident response tactics, techniques, and procedures that I'm going to use, right? And when you do this, you have to consider, right, the people, process, and technology at play. Okay, we have this passive network monitoring platform here. Hey, we have in-case enterprise rolled out here, right? As you're building IR procedures at this phase, we're at the very kind of reality of, okay, what am I actually going to do when something happens based on these different types, right? You need to understand here when those incident response capabilities do differ between spaces. And a big one today, you need to understand also, where are you going to get data, but where's data also going to be challenging to get it from, right? What's your visibility in the cloud? What's your visibility with, zero trust architecture or some of the other single sign-on or other web services you're using? Understanding how your business operates and the data at hand is going to be critical to getting incident response procedures that fit you, that aren't just best practices. There's a lot of really good best practices out there. But if you're really wanting to bring down the mean time to recovery, the mean time to actually, respond and be back on your feet, thinking through this process and making sure it's streamlined is very important. One approach is an approach called the collection management framework. This is somewhat of a US military term in there, but if you Google it, there actually are quite a few blogs from Dragos, from a few other vendors that kind of show how to do this. But what a collection management framework is at its root cause is, what data is actually being collected, right? And when we talk about environments, you can do one per environment to say, okay, what data is collected in North American operations for our business? What data is collected in, European operations for our business, right? Then you can get into how are we going to process the data? What are our tools? How are we going to scale analysis here, right? How are we going to, work around any regionalisms, right? If you're in the UK, right, I think there's GDPR requirements around some stuff you have to watch there too. So, understanding where your data is and making sure you can process it, making sure your analysts are trained to process it too. That all falls into this step of, okay, we understand what we need to do. We understand the environments we're in. Now we need to understand how we're going to do it. This step is going to take the longest, and especially as you have a big enterprise. And if you have a big enterprise to where, you're sharing data with a lot of people, you're working with people from other countries that might work differently than you too, right? Some of the regionalism, some of the differences in that. This is where you really capture kind of the essence of, hey, let's connect our business operations with how this incident response procedure is, how we're actually going to use them. But very, very critical step because this is the step that you will do when the plan actually activates. The policy and procedures are great. This is hopefully going to drive your actions when you actually end up in this scenario. The fourth thing you need to do once you document, or once you create that document, once you actually write the procedures and tailor it to you, is actually document, practice, and update all of these procedures frequently, right? Opportunities to actually use it. You should learn when you're actually doing cases, things like tabletop exercises where you're either bringing people into a conference room and running through scenarios, or if you're actually doing tabletop exercises where you're actually pulling live data and confirming you can do it. Those are all critical, right? Because that's where you can test to say, okay, how accurate is this IR policy? How much does this IR policy actually fit our operations? Another thing you should always do is an IR review, right? You should do these at least annually, if not more. You should also have processes for updating this, right? Because as you're getting this feedback, right, you want someone to say, hey, during this actual case, I tried to use these procedures. It didn't work well because either we didn't have the data or we weren't capable of processing it. That's good to know, right? Because you can say, okay, well, in the future, if we need to do this, hey, maybe we need to make this investment. Maybe we need this tool or training to be ready for this the next time. Or you might say, hey, that data actually isn't really high value. It kind of costs us more time and effort and money than it's worth. You might say, okay, that's not important. That's just wasting our time in a process. But having an established update process is key, because if you just write this document and it's not tailored to you and it goes out of date, people aren't going to use it. Then it's just going to be something that you have to maybe check your SOC 2 compliance box or other box, but doesn't actually have any impact on your organization. And finally, you want to train and hold your team accountable, right? If you're creating incident response plan policy and especially procedures, if your team's not using it, you've kind of wasted time in the process, right? This is where you can say, okay, team, there shouldn't be any surprises if we hit that root level compromise, if we hit that reconnaissance behavior. You should know what to do. You should know how to do it. You should know the resources we have. Because otherwise, if you don't do that, if it's kind of the Wild West, people are just going to do, they're going to go to their own biases and go with, availability or recency bias and just say, hey, I took this and of course I did, so I'll do that. They'll burn a bunch of time to where if you have established procedures, hopefully it'll save them a lot of time. And, ultimately with incident response, it'll be getting your business back online sooner than you would, if you were winging it as you go. So again, what we talked about was how to actually build procedures tailored to your organization and also tailored to your policy document and your IR plan document. I hope this was helpful. Again, this was the third part of the series. Definitely check out the other two videos for how to do incident response plans and how to do policy. All of these videos play into each other. Hopefully this was helpful. We'll definitely do more technical videos on how to build these plans. Today was more about the overall process. If it was helpful, let us know below. If you have ideas on other videos you want us to make, let us know. If you need help with your IR plan, definitely reach out. But thanks for tuning in. We hope to see you back next week.